Growing up, my sister owned every room, and my parents treated her victories like family holidays, while mine barely left a ripple, so I learned to smile, to be useful, to stay in the shadows, and to accept that the story of us had only one lead. And before I go further, let me just say, if you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated, share it in the comments and leave a like, because it means more than you know when stories like this reach others who have lived through the same silence. I tried not to mind, but even on small days, when laughter circled the table and praise flowed in one direction, I felt the weight of being invisible, and I carried it quietly until that wedding day when my sister decided to remind everyone of my place in the family. When the invitations for her wedding arrived, I felt a sharp pull in my chest, because while everyone else gushed over embossed envelopes and flower arrangements, I couldn't ignore the uneasiness that crept in every time I watched her fiancé's careful eyes. He was polite, generous in the kind of ways people admire, but beneath the politeness was a pause, a delay before each smile, like someone measuring a note before playing it. And sometimes, when he thought no one noticed, he looked at my sister not with adoration, but with calculation, as if he were rehearsing something only he understood. The night of the rehearsal dinner should have been harmless, yet I caught a glimpse of something that rattled me. When the speeches ended, my sister's fiancé pulled out a small notebook, nothing dramatic, just a pocket-sized leather book, and as people laughed and clinked glasses, he scribbled something down quickly, then tucked it away. I brushed it off, until I realized he had been doing it all week, quietly recording moments as if collecting evidence. When his eyes met mine across the table, he smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes, and I suddenly felt like he had included me in a secret without asking my permission. On the wedding day, the air smelled of roses and champagne, and everything was timed perfectly, down to the minute. But beneath the music and chatter, I felt a current, like a storm gathering under a polished sky. My sister was radiant, soaking in every compliment as if they were her birthright, while I moved in the background making sure details stayed intact. Then, during her toast, she turned toward me with that playful smirk she had perfected in childhood and dropped a line about how I'd always been the family's late bloomer, how they never doubted I'd eventually catch up. Guests laughed, glasses clinked, and to anyone else it was a harmless tease. But to me, it was years of invisibility packed into a single sentence. My smile stayed fixed, but inside, something gave way. A knot loosening where I had always kept my pain hidden. And then, as the laughter faded, I caught the groom's expression. He wasn't laughing, his jaw was set, his eyes locked on her, and for a fraction of a second his mask slipped. I saw contempt, sharp and cutting, the kind that doesn't appear overnight but builds over years. It vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the same charming grin he showed everyone else, but I had seen it, and it chilled me. The real twist came moments later when he lifted the microphone for his own toast. His voice was warm, smooth, almost rehearsed, thanking the guests, honoring the families, praising my sister. Everyone leaned in, ready for romance. But then he mentioned our hometown, a playground, a winter dance, details that didn't belong in a wedding speech, yet carried the weight of memory. My sister's smile faltered just slightly, enough that I noticed, though the crowd didn't. He described a boy who had once been laughed at, humiliated by someone he admired, left standing alone in front of an entire class. The guests chuckled at first, thinking it was just a quirky childhood anecdote, but as his words sharpened, the laughter thinned into silence. And in that silence, my heart pounded with the realization he wasn't telling a random story, he was telling their story, one my sister never thought would be remembered. When the invitations finally arrived, tucked inside creamy envelopes with golden script that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread, my mother, Margaret, practically teared up at the table while my father, Charles, cleared his throat in that proud way he always reserved for Victoria, and my sister sat there glowing, as if even paper and ink had been designed to celebrate her. But when I held my envelope, I didn't just see an invitation. I felt something heavier than cardstock, because I knew I was being asked once again to take my usual place in the background, smiling on cue and staying useful while the spotlight shone brightly on the daughter who had always been the family's center. Victoria was 3 years older than me, 36 now, and she had never once struggled to command a room, while I had learned from the time we were children that if she sparkled, then everyone else would adjust themselves to her rhythm, including me, and maybe that is why I sensed a tension beneath the surface when Daniel, her fiancé, handed me my envelope with a polite smile that felt just a fraction too careful, as if he were studying me. At the same time he was presenting me with good news. He was handsome in a classic way, tall, with steady gray eyes, well-spoken enough to earn my father's immediate approval, generous in small but thoughtful gestures that made my mother adore him. Yet there was always a pause in his expression, a flicker before each smile, a delay so subtle that most people would never notice. But I did because I have spent my entire life reading rooms quickly, making sure I didn't take up more space than I was allowed. It was at a brunch, 2 weeks before the ceremony, that I realized just how unusual his questions were, because while everyone else leaned in to hear Victoria describe the flowers she had chosen and the string quartet that would play during cocktails, Daniel turned to me, asking what our childhood had been like, whether Victoria had always been the confident one, whether I had been shy, and his tone was friendly enough that no one else paid attention. But the way his eyes held mine felt different, less like curiosity and more like confirmation, as if he already knew the answers and wanted to hear me say them out loud. My parents, of course, adored him instantly. Charles liked his calm manners and stable career. Margaret appreciated the way he remembered her favorite brand of tea, and both of them seemed almost giddy when they spoke about how lucky Victoria was, as if she had once again secured a prize for the family. I wanted to be happy for her too, but each time Daniel's gaze lingered just a little too long, or his hand scribbled something into the small leather notebook he kept in his jacket pocket, I felt the uneasy weight of someone who was rehearsing rather than celebrating, and once, when he looked up and caught me watching him write, he gave me that polite smile again. Only this time, it felt like an acknowledgement, as though he knew I had begun to notice more than I should. The days leading up to the wedding blurred into lists and fittings and late-night calls, and I did what I had always done. I kept the wheels turning silently, pinning hems, adjusting ribbons, smoothing over little disasters before they grew, the kind of invisible labor that makes an event flawless but leaves no trace of who fixed it, and I told myself it was enough, that being useful was a kind of love, even when it went unseen. But at the rehearsal dinner, while everyone toasted to Victoria's future, I saw Daniel's face when the best man joked that he had waited long enough for this day, and for a split second Daniel's jaw tightened, his eyes turning unreadable, and though he quickly covered it with another smooth laugh, I felt a chill in my stomach, because it didn't look like nerves, it looked like restraint, as if the word waited carried an entirely different meaning for him than it did for the rest of us. By the night's end, as I stood outside the restaurant watching the last of the guests slip into their cars, I couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel wasn't only waiting to become my sister's husband, he was waiting for something else entirely, something that none of us had been invited to see yet, and though I brushed it aside and told myself it was nothing, the unease clung to me like perfume on a borrowed dress. The morning of the wedding began with the kind of crisp golden light that seems to promise everything will go perfectly, the kind of morning where even the sidewalks look polished and the air feels rehearsed, as if the whole city had decided to dress up for my sister's big day. And when I stepped into the hotel suite, where Victoria and her bridesmaids were already surrounded by stylists with curling irons and clouds of hairspray, I felt for just a second like I had walked onto a movie set. Every surface gleamed, every detail seemed designed for the camera, and at the center of it all was Victoria, 36 years old, but glowing like she had discovered some secret to staying forever 25. Her gown fitted as if it had been poured over her laughter high and effortless, while Margaret hovered proudly, correcting the smallest details, and Charles stood stiffly near the window, pretending to scroll his phone but smiling in that tight way he always did when pride swelled too large for words. I, on the other hand, did what I had always done. I found the quietest corner, held a small plate of fruit that I barely touched, and waited for the moment when someone would need a pair of scissors, a safety pin, or a calm word. My sister barely looked at me except to ask if I could fasten a clasp or smooth a wrinkle. But when our eyes met in the mirror as I worked on the back of her necklace, I caught a flash of something behind her bright expression, a flicker almost like nervousness, but she pushed it away so quickly with another laugh for the photographer that I wondered if I had imagined it. The ceremony itself unfolded like a perfectly written script, the music swelling on cue, the guests gasping softly as Victoria walked down the aisle, Daniel standing at the altar with his gray eyes steady and unreadable. The vows, spoken with practiced clarity, and the kiss delivered with the confidence of a couple who had rehearsed every movement in their heads for months. People clapped, some even wiped away tears, and for a moment I wanted to believe I'd been wrong about the unease I carried, that maybe Daniel was truly the calm, devoted man he appeared to be, that my sister would finally get the adoration she always craved, and that I could breathe freely in the background without waiting for something to snap. But weddings are not just about vows and kisses. They are about what happens when people pick up microphones. The reception hall glowed with candles and golden light bouncing off crystal glasses. The band played soft melodies that wrapped around the chatter, and servers glided past with trays of champagne. Everything shimmered, but underneath that shimmer was a strange electricity, the kind that makes the hair on your arms lift without knowing why. Victoria was the first to grab the microphone. Of course she was, because she had always claimed center stage without asking, and she began beautifully, thanking our parents for their support, praising Daniel's family for their warmth, and sprinkling in little jokes that kept the room laughing in the easy, indulgent way guests love to laugh at weddings. And then it happened. With her smile sharpened into something just mischievous enough, she turned toward me. Her voice didn't falter, her eyes sparkled, and in a tone polished enough to sound playful, she said, "Some of us just take a little longer to bloom, but we always knew Rachel would catch up eventually." The laughter was instant, loud, full of clinking glasses and tilted heads. People thought it was harmless, a light-hearted family tease, the kind of banter that makes weddings feel real. But for me, it was like she had taken every bruise from childhood, every overlooked achievement, every ignored effort, every moment when I had been told without words that I wasn't enough, and rolled it all into a neat little joke that she could perform in front of 200 people. My smile stayed in place because it had to, because I had trained myself for this exact role, the smiling background figure who absorbs the sting so that no one else feels awkward. But inside, something shifted, quiet and irreversible, like a thread snapping in a dress you thought was perfectly sewn. What surprised me wasn't just the sting of her words, it was what I saw when I looked at Daniel. He wasn't laughing. While the room shook with amusement, his jaw tightened, his eyes darkened, and for a heartbeat, his face revealed something he'd hidden so carefully until now. It wasn't embarrassment, it wasn't nerves, it was disdain, sharp and cold, the kind of expression you see on someone who has been waiting for a moment to arrive. And then, just as quickly, he replaced it with a smooth grin, nodding toward the crowd, clapping lightly with the rest of them. But I had seen it, and once you see something like that, you cannot unsee it. Even stranger, I noticed Daniel's mother, Grace, watching him closely, as if she too had caught that flicker and was trying to piece it together. She whispered something to Edward, who frowned and shook his head, but her eyes didn't leave her son. For the first time, I realized I wasn't the only one paying attention. As Victoria passed the microphone onto the best man, basking in the applause, I sat there with my glass frozen in my hand, my smile stretched too wide, and the sound around me muffled, like I was underwater. Something in me knew this wasn't the end of her joke, it was the beginning of something else entirely. The stage had been set, the audience was warmed up, and when Daniel finally stood to give his own speech, the air in the room shifted. Even before he opened his mouth, I felt it, the awareness that he hadn't been waiting for vows or rings. He had been waiting for this very moment, with every eye upon him, and whatever came next would not be the toast of a groom. It would be something else altogether, something that would change the way we all remembered this day. Daniel stood slowly when the best man handed him the microphone, and the applause that rose around the room sounded warm and expectant, the kind of applause that carries the assumption of charm and romance. And he began exactly the way everyone hoped he would, with polished gratitude, thanking Margaret and Charles for welcoming him into the family, praising Grace and Edward for their support, and sprinkling in light compliments about the bridal party that drew a soft wave of laughter from the tables. His voice was calm, deliberate, the kind of tone that settles easily in a crowded hall, and for a moment I wondered if the flicker I had seen in his expression earlier had only been my imagination. But then, almost imperceptibly, the rhythm of his words shifted. He began talking about the idea of waiting, how some people spend years searching for the right partner, how sometimes timing plays tricks on you, how the person you think will never notice you can end up standing right in front of you years later. The crowd smiled. Some couples squeezed each other's hands, assuming it was another tender, romantic line. But I watched Victoria's face, and though she kept her practiced smile steady, I saw her eyes blink too quickly, her lips press just a fraction tighter, because she too recognized something hidden in his tone. Daniel went on, describing childhood memories of growing up in our town, of walking past the high school bleachers, of the winter fundraiser when paper snowflakes had been taped to the gym ceiling, of how some moments from youth never really leave you no matter how many years pass. The room grew quiet, politely expectant, not realizing that his words weren't just charming nostalgia, but carefully chosen details that carried the weight of someone who had never forgotten a very specific night. I felt my stomach twist because I remembered that fundraiser vividly, not for myself, but for Victoria. She had been crowned chair of the event, praised endlessly for her leadership, while I stayed after with a broom in my hand, sweeping glitter into piles no one would ever see, and I remembered how Daniel had been there too, a quiet boy carrying boxes twice his size, trailing after volunteers just to stay near the action. It was a small memory, buried so deep I hadn't thought of it in years, but the way Daniel's voice lingered over it now made it feel alive again, pulsing in the center of the room. Grace shifted in her chair, leaning toward Edward, whispering something that made him frown, while a couple of guests exchanged puzzled glances as though they weren't sure where the speech was going. And still Daniel pressed on, weaving a story about a boy who once carried his heart like a fragile thing, only to have it stepped on, laughed at, ignored, left standing in the cold. His tone wasn't bitter exactly, but it wasn't tender either. It was measured, deliberate, as if every word had been stored and rehearsed, waiting for the right moment to be released. My chest felt tight, because though he never said her name, I knew, and more importantly, Victoria knew. Her hand tightened on the stem of her glass, her smile frozen so perfectly that it almost looked painful, and for the first time in my life, I saw my sister not as the center of attention, but as someone caught in a spotlight she could not control. The guests still didn't fully understand, some leaning forward with curiosity, some assuming he was working toward a sweet moral about fate and love, but the undercurrent in his voice told me otherwise, and the longer he spoke, more, I felt the truth. That this was not a toast of gratitude, it was the opening act of something far more dangerous. The first crack in the glass of a story my family had been polishing for decades. And as Daniel paused, letting the silence stretch before his next sentence, I realized the entire room was leaning in, waiting, believing they were about to hear a romantic confession, not realizing that what was coming would not seal the marriage, but split it wide open. Daniel let the silence linger in the room just long enough that people began to shift in their seats, and then he smiled the kind of smile that doesn't warm a room but freezes it, the kind that lets you know something very different is coming. At first his words seemed harmless, almost romantic in their rhythm, talking about admiration, about the kind of youthful longing that fills a boy's chest when he sees someone who seems brighter than the rest. Someone he thinks will change his world if she only notices him. And the crowd leaned forward with soft grins, expecting a tender confession of first love. But then his tone sharpened, barely perceptible at first, like a blade sliding slowly out of its sheath. And he said that admiration can turn into something else when it is answered with cruelty. The music from the band faded, not because they stopped, but because every ear in the room had tuned to his voice. And when he described a boy who had once carried boxes twice his size just to be near the girl he adored, a few guests chuckled, thinking it was just another silly childhood anecdote. But then Daniel said the boy had been laughed at, mocked openly, left standing with his heart split in front of everyone, and the laughter caught in their throats. The sound in the hall changed, no longer light and easy but thick and uncertain, a silence that pressed against every table. I felt my breath lock in my chest because I remembered that night, the winter fundraiser, the paper snowflakes taped to the gym ceiling, my sister at the center of it all, dazzling in her role as chair of the event, while I swept glitter from the floor at the end of the night. I had seen Daniel then, not as the man he was now, but as the boy with careful eyes who kept to the corners, and I remembered with a jolt that chilled me, how Victoria had laughed with her friends when he stumbled, how her voice had carried across the gym like a song meant to humiliate. It had been such a small moment to her that she forgot it within a week, but for him it had carved itself into his bones. And then he said it. That girl's name was Victoria Morgan. The words hit the room like a stone dropped into glass. A gas broke from somewhere near the bridal table. A fork clattered onto a plate, and even the servers froze mid-step with trays balanced in their hands. Margaret's fingers went to her pearls, her face draining of color, while Charles sat back hard in his chair, his mouth opening, but no words coming out. Across the room, Grace stared down at the tablecloth, her lips pressed thin, while Edward shifted uncomfortably, as if he wanted to stand but couldn't find the courage. The guests didn't know where to look. Some turned to each other in disbelief, whispering behind raised hands. Others fixed their eyes on Victoria as if expecting her to laugh and dismiss it as some private joke. But Victoria couldn't find her voice. For the first time in all my years, I saw my sister's composure crack. Her smile faltered, her lips trembled against the rim of her glass, and a flush spread across her face that no amount of makeup could conceal. She tried to let out a laugh, high, brittle, the kind of laugh she used to brush aside awkwardness, but it died instantly in the silence, leaving only the faint echo of her failure hanging in the air. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calmness was more unsettling than anger could have ever been. He told her, and all of us, that he had waited years for this day, not out of love, not for the joy of marriage, but to stand in front of her the way he had once stood in front of that gym, powerless and humiliated, and reverse the balance. He said while she had forgotten him completely, he had never forgotten her, that her laughter had followed him like a shadow, shaping every choice, every victory, every late night spent building a life strong enough to lead him right back to her. And now, here she was, the one cornered, the one stripped of control. Gasps rippled again, and a bridesmaid at Victoria's side covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with shock. One of Daniel's cousins muttered, "Oh my God," under his breath, and I saw a woman at the next table lean so far forward her wine nearly tipped. My mother whispered something frantic to my father, but his hand stayed frozen on the table, white-knuckled, as if gripping the linen would hold the room together. I sat still, unable to move, unable even to sip from the glass I held in my hand, because I realized I was watching something I had dreamt of in secret for years, a moment when my sister, so untouchable, so certain of her power, would finally feel what it meant to be small. And yet it didn't feel like triumph, not entirely, because the chill in Daniel's voice made it clear this wasn't about justice alone. This was about a lifetime of bitterness finally spilling into the open. And then came the most unexpected moment of all. Victoria's eyes, wide and frantic, darted around the room, searching for someone, anyone, who could rescue her. And then they landed on me. Just for a second, her gaze locked with mine. And in that brief exchange, I saw something I had never seen in her eyes before. Not confidence, not pride, not superiority, but raw, naked fear. Daniel didn't sit down after his revelation, and the silence that stretched across the hall was almost unbearable, the kind of silence that makes you hear things you never notice, the faint buzz of the overhead lights, the clink of ice melting in abandoned glasses, the creak of a chair as someone shifted nervously. And in that silence, he looked at Victoria with such unnerving calm that the whole room seemed to hold its breath. He raised the microphone again and spoke, not louder but softer, as if daring the crowd to lean in. And he said that humiliation has a way of shaping people, of settling into your bones until it becomes part of who you are. And that when a boy's laughed at long enough, he either breaks or learns how to wait, and he had chosen to wait. The guests were frozen in place. I saw one of Victoria's bridesmaids grip the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles went white, while another whispered frantically behind her hand to the groomsman beside her, but the words went unheard in the thick air. Margaret sat rigid, her pearl necklace clutched between her fingers as if it could protect her daughter, and Charles leaned back in his chair with his jaw clenched so hard I thought I could hear his teeth grind. Across the room, Grace and Edward stared at their son in shock, Grace's eyes shimmering with something like recognition, as though she had always known Daniel carried an old wound, but had never imagined he would rip it open in front of 200 guests. Victoria opened her mouth as if to speak, to laugh, to dismiss it as a joke, but no sound came out. She tried again, a brittle laugh scraping from her throat, but it fell flat and made the silence even heavier, as though the room itself rejected her attempt to rewrite what had just been spoken. She set her glass down quickly, but the tremor in her hand made the stem clink against the plate, a sharp sound that made several guests flinch. Daniel pressed forward, painting the memory in such vivid detail that it was impossible not to see it. He described the gym floor slick with fresh wax, the paper snowflakes dangling from strings overhead, the smell of popcorn from the concession stand, and the way his younger self had carried those heavy boxes with the desperate hope of being noticed, only to hear laughter, her laughter, ripple across the crowd like a cruel melody that wouldn't leave his ears for years. He said her voice had followed him into boardrooms, into negotiations, into every single moment where he fought to prove himself, not to the world, but to that boy still standing in the gym, and that every step of his success had been built not to win her approval, but to ensure that one day she would stand where he had once stood, exposed, stripped of power, unable to hide behind applause. A collective gasp moved through the room, as though the guests had all realized at once that this was no wedding toast, but a reckoning. I saw the photographer lower his camera slowly, unsure if he was even allowed to keep recording, while two servers near the doorway froze in place, trays trembling slightly in their hands. A woman at the far table pressed her napkin to her lips as though she might faint, and one of Daniel's cousins whispered, "Oh, God!" loud enough that several heads turned. Victoria's face, usually so carefully composed, betrayed everything at once. Her cheeks burned crimson, her lips trembled as if she were searching for the right words but finding none, and her eyes flicked desperately around the room, hunting for someone to rescue her, to step in, to laugh first so she could follow, but no one did. Even Margaret and Charles sat mute, their expressions locked in shock, unwilling or unable to stand between their daughter and the truth unraveling before everyone. Then Daniel delivered the words that felt like a final blow. He said, "You may have forgotten me, Victoria, but I never forgot you. You taught me who I never wanted to become, and today I wanted you to feel what it's like to stand in a room where everyone can see the truth and no one is laughing with you." The words landed like stones dropped into deep water, heavy and final, and the silence that followed stretched so long that I could hear my own pulse in my ears. My sister, the woman who had always turned every room into her stage, now looked small, crumpled, her eyes wide with something I had never seen before: fear. Her hand shook as she reached for her glass again, but she didn't drink. She only clung to it like a lifeline that could anchor her to the table. And then something unexpected happened. A guest near the back coughed loudly, breaking the stillness, and it triggered a ripple of awkward movements, chairs shifting, people clearing their throats, a few murmurs rising, as if the crowd needed to release some of the unbearable tension. But no one laughed, no one applauded, no one rushed to her defense. The silence returned, thicker than before, and in that silence, Victoria's gaze found mine. It was only a second, but it felt like forever. Her eyes locked on me, pleading, begging, as if for the first time in her life she was the one asking me for help, as if she believed I might somehow know what to do. And in that instant, I realized the shift was complete. I was no longer the invisible sister in the background. I was the witness, the one person in the room who had always known how sharp her words could cut, and now I was the only one who could see her unravel completely. I should have looked away, but I didn't. I held her gaze, and for the first time I felt something I never expected. Not triumph exactly, not pity, but a strange, trembling relief, the kind of relief that comes when life itself finally speaks the words you've been too afraid to say. The silence that followed Daniel's words felt endless, a silence so thick it seemed to press down on every guest like a heavy curtain. And then, as if he had been waiting for that exact moment, he set the microphone carefully back on the stand, smoothed his jacket, and looked directly at Victoria with a calmness that chilled the room. "This," he said quietly, "was never about love. This was about truth." And with that, he turned and began walking away from the head table, his steps unhurried, steady, final, while the hall erupted into gasps and frantic whispers that swirled through the air like a storm breaking loose. Victoria shot up from her chair, her veil slipping askew, her hand reaching out desperately as if to catch him, but Daniel didn't turn back. Her voice, finally breaking free, rose in a trembling cry of his name, but it cracked in the air, brittle and hollow, and for once no one rushed to soothe her. The bridesmaids stared in shock. The groomsmen shuffled uncomfortably. My parents sat frozen. Their pride dissolved into stunned silence. And Grace, Daniel's mother, closed her eyes slowly as if accepting something she had always feared would come. Guests began to move, chairs scraping against the floor, some leaving in hushed disbelief, others lingering to watch the unraveling of what had been promised as the perfect day. The photographer lowered his camera completely, now, unwilling to capture images that no album could ever hold, and the band remained silent, their instruments abandoned, the notes that should have filled the night now swallowed by chaos. Victoria collapsed back into her chair, her face streaked with tears that ruined the flawless makeup she had clung to as her final shield, and she looked smaller than I had ever seen her, no longer the dazzling center of every story, but a woman stripped bare before an audience she could not command. Margaret reached for her hand, but Victoria pulled away, unable to face even her own mother, and Charles muttered something under his breath that sounded like shame. His shoulders hunched as though the weight of years of favoritism had finally settled onto him in one crushing blow. And then, in the strangest twist of all, eyes began to turn toward me. Not accusing, not pitying, but with a kind of recognition, as if they all suddenly remembered that I had been the other daughter, the other sister, the quiet presence, always standing in the wings. I felt dozens of gazes on me, heavy but not cruel, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. I sat still, my hands folded, my heart pounding with a mixture of sorrow and relief, and I realized that I didn't need to say anything. The truth had spoken for me. Daniel reached the doors of the hall, paused for a single moment, and turned his head just enough to meet my eyes across the chaos. There was no smile, no triumph, only a solemn acknowledgement, as if to say, "This was for you too." And then he walked out, leaving behind silence so deep it echoed louder than any applause ever could. In the days that followed, the story of that wedding spread through our town like wildfire, whispered at coffee shops and murmured at office desks, and for once, Victoria wasn't the heroine of the tale, but the cautionary ending. Daniel disappeared from her life entirely, his revenge complete, his chapter closed, and my parents, left to face the wreckage of the daughter they had placed on a pedestal, began to look at me with eyes that carried something new, hesitation, regret, maybe even guilt. And as for me, I will never forget the moment my sister's eyes found mine across that crowded hall, begging for help I could not give, because it was the first time she understood what it felt like to be small, to be powerless, to be left without applause. Justice doesn't always arrive dressed in glory. Sometimes it walks in calmly, speaks softly, and leaves a wreck behind it. And on that night, in that hall filled with flowers and broken silence, everyone who needed to fall finally fell, and everyone who needed to see finally saw. And if you stayed with me through this story, I want to ask you something from the heart. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, or if you've ever seen someone finally get what they deserved, share your thoughts in the comments because I'd love to know I'm not alone in this. Don't forget to hit that like button too. It really helps these stories reach others who need to hear them, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next time I sit down to tell you another secret that turned into a storm.